Huh. Doing something wrong. It keeps wants to go to recording.
You're clicking the green button?
Yeah.
Okay, and are you seeing any options?
None of the options that allow me to do it on the iPad. So we can do without the PowerPoint.
Well, if you want to post the PowerPoint in the file or email it, I can share it and use the PowerPoint on my desktop. Yeah, you have to have a special plugin in order to share from an iPad.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know that at the time.
I think you have to. Well, no, it's there. Huh. Maybe the version you have on the iPad may not be. But
yeah, we'll just do it without.
Okay.
All right.
You'll post the PowerPoint. I'll get it to everybody on the realm so they'll have that.
Right. So I want to thank Master James because for those who don't know me, my background has been in the area of disaster mental health and in disaster training. I'm a retired associate professor of emergency and disaster management and a curriculum developer. My ministry since COVID started has been a PTSD and moral injury counselor via the phone. We did try to do it via Zoom, but that was not as successful. I taught developmental psychology to nursing students at New York University for about 15 years, and I have about 3,000 plus students in the New York area. And as you saw at the beginning of COVID, those hospitals were just slammed. And my nursing students remembered that I did this, and they also knew about my theological background. This has been rather rewarding, but also very tiring, because when you get off shift at 11 o'clock at night and you start calling me at 1 o'clock in the morning Central Time, it creates very small sleep patterns. Right off, an apology for my pronunciation. With 6 years of Catholic seminary Latin, it has corrupted many of my pronunciations, although my voice teacher liked my Italian, but deplored my Spanish. So I apologize to all those from Puerto Rico and from Colombia who may be on. The talk will look at 5 different aspects. One area that I wasn't able to build in because of the time constraints, but I will be doing an even fuller recording, and that is dealing with the current and the role of AIDS and the role that Dominicans have played since the AIDS pandemic started. But I will look first at an overview of pandemics and epidemics. Then I'll look at what happened to the European Dominicans as a result of the pandemic, particularly looking at Catherine of Siena and Little Margaret, also known as Blessed Margaret of Castello, who I have fallen in love with. The third would be an overview of pandemics and epidemics in the Caribbean and Latin America as a result of the Spanish conquest. And then looking at the Latin American Dominicans, particularly St. Martin de Porres and St. Rose of Lima, and then some final comments. We know that Catherine of Siena wrote over 400 letters and prayers. Imagine what she could do if she were alive today on Zoom, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. I could just imagine the mystical encounters we would find on TikTok every day. And I would be very happy to have had that opportunity to view those. At the height of the plague in 1349, the poet Petrarch wrote, "The life we lead is a sleep. Whatever we do, dreams. Only death breaks the sleep and wakes us from dreaming. I wish I could have woken before this." His own son, Giovanni, survived the plague only to die when there was the reoccurrence in 1361. Now, bubonic plague, or otherwise known as Black Death, is the deadliest of all diseases, the most lethal pandemic in all of history. The bacterium that invades and spreads within the body is unique because it can be spread via 2 different vectors. One is an insect, a trait which it shares with malaria and typhus, or human-to-human transmission, which in trade it shares with influenza, coronaviruses, tuberculosis, and smallpox. The bubonic plague is the most common and widely known form of this disease, and it's still around us today. If you may have seen on the news that there is one person with bubonic plague in China, and now China is closing down that area so that it does not spread. Now it spreads because of fleas, where they bite the host and then move on. When they bite the host, unfortunately, their stomachs are full and they're blocked because of the bacteria that the virus is created within the stomach of the flea. So the flea has to regurgitate its meal back into the host. And that's how it's spread from flea to host, from host to flea and back again. Though the black rat was the most common and was the most highly susceptible to the disease. But once the rat dies, the fleas have to find someone else to be the host to feed from. And they will jump anywhere they can as long as it has some fur. So humans are in that category. In the last millennium before Christ, humankind entered a new era in writing about disease. References to disease epidemics multiply in the Bible, and it's usually generalized terms such as plague, which makes it very difficult to identify any specific illness. Fully half of the references of plague in the Bible occur in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, recorded between the 10th and the 5th century BCE. In Leviticus and Deuteronomy, which contain approximately 60 mentions of the term, plague here is associated with a skin disease that may have been leprosy, and we will see Catherine and little Margaret were very active in the ministry to the lepers in their area. The 6th plague that afflicted the Egyptians in Exodus 9:10, the plague that struck down the Philistines in 1 Samuel 4:6, are associated with the true plague in reference to boils and tumors. In the Roman world, the first pandemic, also known as the plague of Justinian, struck the Mediterranean world between 451 and 750 in the Common Era. The second pandemic, more commonly referred to as the Black Death, struck Europe and the Middle East beginning in 1347-1348 and persisted periodically down to the 18th and 19th centuries with roughly a 50% morbidity. The third pandemic of bubonic plague struck Asia at the turn of the 20th century, starting in Hong Kong in 1894 and Mumbai, India in 1896. It lasted to the 1990s in India and Senegal, and the 1950s in Thailand and 1960s in Vietnam, and continued in the Western US when it first arrived in San Francisco in 1900. As a combat medic in the Army with Special Action Forces Asia, I saw plague firsthand in Thailand and Vietnam and on the island in the archipelago, Ryukyu archipelago of Japan. The Venerable Bede mentions that St. Cuthbert received a tumor on his side. So it's very likely that that was the introduction period, not from Cuthbert, but it was around the time that it was first coming into England. And even after 1348, the problem remained in that the epidemic reoccurred periodically here and there, but wars and other calamities also aggravated the situation, like the 100 Years' War in particular. The friars were so weakened in health that they could not do their work or gain vocations. The Irish friars, for example, sent a petition to Pope Clement VI in 1348 asking for permission to eat meat in all of their priories as they could not find sufficient other foods. In the second half of the 14th century, the Dominican nuns were disorganized almost universally, the Dominican nuns were disorganized as a result of the Black Death and the decline of religious discipline. Some even petitioned for release from the Dominican family. They wanted to go to another order because the friars were in utter discord as a result of this laxity of the rule because of not having sufficient food, and because who wants to follow the rule when you have a pandemic on your hand? So the encyclicals of the Masters Generals and the letters of St. Catherine of Siena are all at once demonstrating this terrible state of affair. The English prior provincial made an attempt to pull all things together and set to work to reestablish the fervor and discipline that had previously existed. Even John Wycliffe at first loudly praised the Dominican friars and was against the secular priesthood and the monks. His own preachers adapted the garb of the Franciscans and the ideals of life of the Dominicans, but he would turn, as would Chaucer, on the Dominicans and the other friars, mendicants, that were in England at the time. The reputation of the friars as a whole sank considerably from the Black Death onward for about 100 years, from the reign of King Edward III to the reign of King Henry V. But the rise of Louderdry and strenuous opposition which it provoked seems to have a beneficial effect in covering up the misdeeds of the Dominican friars. But we do see that the list of wills provided all over England, the donations from these wills to the friars showed that the people started to have good esteem for them again. Right at the beginning of the Black Death in the city of London, we see the mayor asking the Dominicans to be the official guides to its inhabitants for their spiritual lives during this period of pandemic, so that many of the London inhabitants and its priests were being struck down without the comfort of spiritual ministration. The king wrote to Pope Boniface IX asking for a well-known Dominican in England, John of Worthing, to be given faculties to absolve all individuals in these times of troubles. And you may have seen how the Catholic Church in the United States during this time of COVID has given general absolutions across the board. The Dominicans ministered in person, like their illustrious brothers, St. Antonius and St. Louis Bertrand, to the plague stricken in their respective cities. St. Antonius, Florence's most beloved archbishop, was to be seen leading a mule laden with everything that he could find to ease the sufferings and alleviate the distress of those who had fallen victims to the plague. In The Great Mortality by John Kelly, notes that the mortality rates for priests during the Black Death were 42 to 45%, which is higher than the overall mortality for the general population, with the consensus being during this first pandemic being around 30% for the general population. There were so few priests as this disease progressed within Europe that Pope Clement VI declared that the dying could make their confession to anyone present. An English bishop, Barbara Tuckman, notes, said that you could confess to even to a woman and that it would still lead to salvation. We've come away since then. Clement VI later found it necessary to grant remission of sin to all who died of the plague because so many were left unattended by the priest. In the aftermath of the Black Death, the church's reputation never quite recovered, as the new priests who were quickly brought in to fill the void were not as scholarly or thoroughly trained as those who had died. Hennenbusch notes that the order's second crisis, and he notes 5 crises, but the second one was this internal decline, which was shared with the church and other orders as a result of the Black Death and the wars and calamities during this time. After 1285, the Dominicans Masters General were no longer of the caliber of Dominic's early successors. So the friars and their leadership was on the decline. The 14th century was marked by the decline of scholasticism, a deterioration of morality, and a crumbling of society generally. So what was happening in society was also happening in the convents of the Dominicans. The decline of the friars to the common life and to study grew progressively weak until it broke down completely. The choir, the refectory, and the classroom now stood empty. The refectory was attended only by friars who could not otherwise provide for their own food or drink. The convent was not generally providing for their membership. Fasts and abstinences ceased to be observed. And some merchants would actually bring their carts into the refectory to sell food to the friars who were there. So they would have to purchase their own food because, again, it was not being provided. A private life had begun. It was no longer the communal life. They were now by themselves in their cells, going about the world without coming back when there was the times for prayer, the times for study, or any common life whatsoever. It was common for the friars to attain their own clothing now, and vanity in clothing appeared. And again, this was common for all religious orders, not just the Dominicans. Study was neglected. The lectors didn't even show up to give their classes, and the students who did attend didn't even bother to study. They weren't prepared. Kind of like the 21st century students that I've taught recently. Apostasy from the religious houses may have been partly responsible for the issue on 20 July 1354 by the King Edward III of an order to all sheriffs and bailiffs to arrest all those of the order of Friars Preacher whom they shall find vagabond in their bailiwicks, as the prior provincial or any prior conventual of the said order shall intimate to them and deliver them to the said priors, who would put them in the provincial jail. 2 attempts were made to halt the decline of the Dominican order as a result of the pandemic. One was by Raymond of Capua, the Master General in the Roman obedience, not the Avignon obedience. And again, through Catherine and through Raymond's writing of Catherine's recordings, we know that Catherine had to bring about the change from the Avignon obedience and bringing the Pope back to Rome. And Raymond was definitely one in the Roman obedience. He began a reform in 1389, calling on all the provinces to establish at least one house of observance. And again, we see the Franciscans and other Dominican orders having to do the same thing. So you had the observant Franciscans, now you have the observant Dominicans as well. The reform priorities were organized the reformed priories were organized into a semi-autonomous congregation, owing to the hostility of the non-reformed friars. They wanted to keep things as they were. So by the early 16th century, the order was largely reformed, though there were pockets yet still of non-reformed priories that existed. There was a generalized province for missionary work, which was from the observant Dominicans, which continues in part today. The friars also succeeded in reforming monasteries of the Dominican nuns, because how the friars go, so follow the nuns. So it bears repeating that the state of the friars is always reflected in the state of the nuns. The reform came into full fruition just when the friars were most needed to fight the Reformation and to initiate the New World missions in Africa, Asia, and in Central, Southern, and the Caribbean Americas. An interesting paper by Michael Vargas titled "How a Brood of Vipers Survived the Black Death: Recovery and Dysfunction in the 14th Century Dominican Order." Now, he kind of takes, has a disagreement with Hindenbusch and some of the other writers, in that he thinks that they write about this period putting a good light on the Dominicans and not really telling the story. So Vargas goes and searches records throughout. Records during the time were not as accurately kept But he found that the Aragon province, their records were pretty much intact from this period. And in these records, he notes that the ranks of the preaching friars actually grew during the pandemic, but not at the same pace as their Franciscan counterparts. Apparently, the mortification of the Franciscans was more attractive for someone who was facing possible death due to the pandemic than the intellectual and contemplative life of the Dominicans. And they were, the recruitment was less discriminating amongst the Franciscans. They weren't as concerned about the social status nor about the academic potential of recruits. In the 14th century, the difficulty for the Dominicans became apparent in Aragon and the other Spanish provinces at the time. A decline in membership began around the year 1300, with increasing numbers of the order's external critics accusing the Dominicans of engaging in activities contrary to the selfless and austere charity of St. Dominic and his first followers. Juan Ruiz compared the black robe preachers as ravenously hunger for favors and bequests to crows circling and cawing over the bodied of the dead and dying from the Black Death. The Black Death was the second circumstance for the disciplinary decline. Again, the wars and other calamities would fit into this, but again, the masters generals were not of the caliber that they had once been, and the individuals within the priories were not as they had once been. So the plague left empty priories and devastated provinces throughout Europe. There was a slow disciplinary decline around 1300, which turned in operational decline after 1350. And David Knowles in the Bear Ruin Choirs faults the Dominicans for the decline of the other orders, leading to the dissolution of the English monasteries. By the spring of 1348, in northeastern Iberia as elsewhere, the plague assault of 1348 to 50 was a catastrophe like none before, a social trauma on a scale beyond reckoning. The Dominican province of Aragon suffered no less than the other Dominican provinces, and the order as a whole took a heavy hit to its convent population, as did the other religious orders. But the leaders of the Aragon province continued to open new convents during this time and to maintain the size of its body of friars. The province leaders in Aragon were able to restore the population of the province's robust levels within a few years after the end of the second pandemic. Aragon reported 510 dead in the years 1347 and 1348. Those who died were the best and the most senior friars. The pre-plague population of 640 friars reported 510 deaths. But within 200 years after the end of this first wave of the pandemic, the convents again in Aragon were almost back equal to that 640 pre-plague population of friars. Assignments into the Aragon convents in this period after 1350 show a growth pattern consistent with the first half of the 13th century. And despite intermittent periods of high plague mortality, outside the order, it was nearly 70% of the friars active in 1348 were dead 3 years later by 1351. The mid-century mortality did not create a problem of insufficient manpower. The difficulty and failures of Dominican preachers that began as early as the order's first decades became ineffective with emerging public relations deficits and image problems because they were drinking and brawling, stealing chickens, and inside the convents, they were having fistfights, dissensions, and theft. They were throwing out the priors conventual and the priors provincials. They turned privilege into a tradition. And because of all these, the history of granting exemptions would become exacerbated and increased hundredfolds during the time of the Black Death. Eating meat was contravention to the order's explicit constitutional prohibition. But again, remembering the Irish had asked the Pope for permission, as there was no other food. And by the mid-century, meat eating had become standardized for most of the Dominican friars. The 1378, at the election of the two Roman pontiffs, tore into two the threadbare cloth of universal Christendom. Cue St. Catherine of Siena. The Dominican province declaring for one or the other pope, again, exacerbated what had happened during the Black Death, was made now even worse by who is your allegiance to. And again, Raymond of Capua, Master General, was in the Roman obedience. So let me look at St. Catherine of Siena. I have to admit that I was not one who was as enamored with Catherine as I have begun. I was not aware of her ministry to those who were sick and ill. And when we look at a Dominican tertiary, Sister Mary Elizabeth O'Brien, who is has her doctorate in nursing, has written 3 terrific books, and you will see in the PowerPoint, I give you the covers for each one of those. One is Catherine of Siena, A Sacred Covenant of Caring for the Sick. And she did the same also for Blessed Margaret of Castile, Little Margaret, and St. Martin de Porres. I wish he would write one for St. Rose of Lima. Catherine is the patroness of those who care for the sick. Catherine is the patroness of all who minister to the ill. She was born in 1347. She's only 7 months old when the first round of the second plague arrived in Siena from Sicily in October 1347. She survived the Black Death as an infant, as did her entire huge family. But the disease remained rampant in this era. The first horrendous plague outburst was in 1348. The friars were living in communal settings, and they were severely impacted because of living in common. The number of friars in the Dominican Priory at Montpelier fell in 1 year from 140 to 7. In Florence, 78 friars died, and in Siena, 50 of them succumbed to the plague. The appalling losses suffered by the mendicant orders in the Middle Ages of the 14th century shook the very foundation of religious life. Who wants to live in community if you're going to die by living in that community? So the natural and religious bonds for all of Christianity dealing with this pandemic became annihilated. There was no ecclesial ceremony. There was no being able to broadcast from the cathedral on Facebook. The dead were abandoned. They were just thrown indiscriminately into the street. They were thrown in the great trenches, hastily dug in different parts of the city. Families would leave the deceased in the house and disappear and go somewhere else without even notifying that there were dead in the house. Now, Catherine was to become a third order sister of penance of St. Dominic, usually called the mantellate, because of the mantle that they wore. They did not wear the capuche or the scapular like we do. They tended to be older women who were widows. So Catherine, being in her early age, unmarried, was not their typical recruit. So they had to put her through a testing period. And their primary ministry was service in the hospitals, visiting and caring for the sick in their homes and ministering to prisoners. And Catherine showed through her example that she was able to do the ministry of the Sisters of Penance of St. Dominic. Now, there are 3 hospitals that Catherine was involved in Siena, the largest being Santa Maria della Scala, then a more medium-sized one, the Casa della Misericordia, and the leper hospital, San Lazario. And she would work at all 3, as well as we will see with the prisons. Now, not having the slide, I have to read from my notes. On this feast of St. Cajetan, it's kind of coincidence that one of the living Dominicans that I've been reading is Father Cajetan Cuddy. And he has been writing about the intellectual monasticism of the Dominicans, particularly on the order of St. Thomas's, which gives shape to our understanding of the human person. And he has done a foreword to a book on interpreting St. Thomas, and is he similar to, and I'm blocking the name of the French Dominican who had written so extensively, but it's doing a comparison. Are they alike or are they different? But he does a review of Rod Dreyer and his Benedict option, and calls out Rod Dreyer. And I love this because I'm writing a book called the Dominic option. It calls him out that genuine monastic inclination does not include the desire to escape reality, to escape the world, but rather the desire to realize wise order in reality. Now, Catherine is just the opposite of the intellectual monasticism, and she introduces, through her ministry, what has become known as public monasticism. So again, with the Dominicans, that you have to have a prayer life in conjunction with your study and in conjunction with your ministry, and it cannot just be that we are monks in a convent who are praying all the time and doing work for the sustenance of the convent. We're being called out into the ministry. So an author, Giordani, in his book, Catherine of Siena, Fire and Blood, writes that each morning, setting out on her first works of charity, bearing a cargo of bread, wine, oil, and other supplies, Catherine climbed the stairs of the poor, opened their rickety doors, left her gifts, and being careful not to make her presence known, moved on to other hovels. She was able to do this because as a tertiary, she was not obliged to conventional residence. She did not have to live in a convent. Here was a new possibility in monasticism, he writes. We may call it public monasticism, where religious life, not distinct, but fused and infused in the life of the world. So in her dialogue, paragraph 7, what gave her impetus to get out of her home and to go out into the streets and into homes, into the hospitals, and to the leprosarium was a vision where she learned from Christ, quote, "The service you cannot render me, you must do for your neighbor," unquote. Her Dominican disciple and comrade, Fra Tommaso Caffarini, wrote in the 14th century of her care for the plague victims. He was the first to begin giving us documentation of that. Never did she appear more admirable than at this time, he wrote. She prepared them for death. She buried them with her own hands. I myself, he wrote, witnessed her joy and with which she tended them. Blessed Raymond of Capua in his legend includes a chapter titled Charity Towards the Infirm on Catherine's ministry during the plague. One of the stories is her ministry during the plague in the hospital, and 2 of the stories are about her going into the homes. In dialogue, paragraph 144, Catherine is recorded by Raymond as saying, "Your hands were made to serve their need. Your feet were given you to serve by carrying your body to places that are holy and useful to you and your neighbors for the glory and praise of my name." The motto for Catherine was that those whom Christ loved, Catherine must love. We see this kind of repeated later on in St. Vincent de Paul, who told his sisters, "There will be times when you will need to leave God to go to God." And Catherine found that extremely true. She exhorted her fellow Dominican tertiaries. She ministered to them who themselves were ministered. And they were providing care and comfort to the sick, and she was ministering and providing care and comfort to her fellow tertiaries. The first appearance of the plague in Siena did not have a major impact on Catherine and her family. This outbreak occurred in 1348 while the saint was still an infant, as I mentioned. But it was the second plague epidemic in the city of Siena in 1374, which did touch both Catherine, her family, her friends, and her loved ones. Anecdotes abound in Siena of physicians and priests falling over dead while in the midst of ministering to their patients dying of the plague. The disease, as I've mentioned, was highly contagious. The biblical reference to the plagues, as I've mentioned, deemed that this was punishment for mankind's sin. And as a consequence, the victims and their families were ostracized as sinners, as well as being afraid that they would pass on the contagion to them. The churches in affected areas provided pits where dead bodies could be buried anonymously. And Catherine, in the midst of the Black Death, is also ministering to those with Hansen's disease or leprosy at San Lazario Hospital. And Catherine herself would eventually show signs of leprosy on one of her hands. The leper house, Lazar house, or leprosarium in 11th century Europe began having an epidemic in the 11th century of leprosy, which spread throughout Europe. A third area where Catherine cared for those mortally injured was the feuds amongst the citizens of Siena. She became known for her mediation, which became attractive for the Pope in order to deal with mediation amongst the rulers and within the church itself. So there's a hatred between certain families. There were many cases of stab wounds, similar to today's gun violence, gun warfare. Catherine would be in the forefront of Moms Against Gun Violence. She organized a group of young men who were willing, for her sake, to become stretcher bearers, and they would pick up the wounded from the street and carry them into the hospitals, kind of like the forerunner of the Red Cross. This was the disease of feud violence, of reciprocity, of a culture of honor, and of vendettas. Now, like Florence Nightingale, Catherine is also known as the Lady with the Lantern. She covered both hospitals at night, walking from person to person with her lantern and a scent bottle during the second horrendous plague, kind of like early aromatherapy. The smell from the bubonic plague of the deterioration of human flesh can be quite repugnant, and she did not want to show that. Plus, she wanted to help give relief to the person who was stricken by bringing in a scent different than what they were smelling within the hospital confines. She spent hours listening and counseling anxious patients in order to comfort their minds. A sick or injured person's spiritual needs remained always forefront in Catherine's mind in her ministry. She prayed with and for her patients, advised them to pray for themselves and to receive the sacrament, the penance, and the Eucharist. She encouraged them to confess their faults. Catherine, to use a 50-cent word, was a forerunner of what today we would call psychoneuroimmunology. The aspect of, by knowing someone is praying for me, and even not knowing, but people praying for me, will have an impact upon my health. So she was an early exponent of this. She cared for the sick during the long hours while the other staff were sleeping. So she was able to relieve them and go and take care and minister to those who were having discomfort. The Sisters of Penance of St. Dominic were also early home health nurses, seeking out those at home alone in their sickness who had fallen in the street with no one to help them. In the spring of 1374, Catherine had returned from Florence to her home in Siena and found the city in the grip of a second plague outbreak. At Della Scala Hospital, it's reported there were periods during the plague when Catherine almost never left the building. During this 1374 outbreak, it was reported that for more than 1 year, Catherine rarely went home, but spent her nights and days in the wards, tending to the afflicted. There was also a curfew, so she could not leave at night. But once she was there, Catherine pretty much stayed there the whole time. Now, keep in mind that Catherine has no formal training in caring for the sick, and the same we will see for Blessed Margaret of Castile and St. Rose of Lima, all three Sisters of Penance of St. Dominic. Only St. Martin de Porres, the lay servant, the Donato at the Convent of the Holy Rosary in Lima, had any training in healthcare. More on Rose and Martin later. If not, again, I will be recording a full presentation of this. She also had, again, as I mentioned, recruited stretcher bearers to transport those who were injured during the feuds. She again would recruit them to transport those stricken by the plague from all over the city to bring them to the three hospitals. It exceeded the horrors of the 1348 epidemic. It was so violent that the death claimed 1/3 of the Sienese people, including her brother Bartolomeo, her sister Lisa, and 8 of Lapa, who was her mother's grandchildren. Catherine herself dug the graves and buried her young nieces and nephews with her own hands. She buried many people during this time. And while she was going about her work, both dealing with the preparation of the body of the deceased and the burial of the body of the deceased, she would sing hymns of joy as she was going to the dead and returning from the burial of the dead. Blessed Raymond of Capua, her chaplain and counselor, began to exhibit plague and showing symptoms just as if he had Black Death. Raymond had been encouraged by Catherine to go out and visit as many sick as he could to comfort and instruct them. Raymond also found himself almost alone in the city, hardly having time to eat, sleep, or even breathe. Again, so many of the priests had died. But Catherine healed him by putting her head against his forehead and praying silently for him. So very quickly on Little Margaret, or Blessed Margaret of Castello. She's also known as Margaret of Mitola, or the Little Pearl. Margaret means pearl. She was a 14th century Dominican tertiary, again, another sister of Penance of St. Dominic. Margaret was born blind, lame, with a severe curvature of the spine, and she was also very short in stature. Her parents, who were minor nobility, and her father was responsible for a castle for protection within the Vatican State, were very embarrassed by the birth of their daughter. And they secluded her in a cell after the age of 6 to a chapel in a forest from ages 6 to 18, where she lived very much like a religious anchoress, like Julia of Norwich. Because of the impending war, her parents brought her from that cell back to their palace and hid her in a vault in the basement, because they did not want, if they were attacked and captured, they did not want her disabilities, her handicaps, to be seen, because it would be a disgrace because of their social rank. Soon, the war never came. She was released, and they took her to the city of Castello in the hopes of a miracle. They took her to a tomb of a holy Franciscan brother, Blessed Giacomo. They left her there next to praying next to the shrine. They had hoped that when they returned, they would find that she was healed, but she was not. So they left her without even saying a word. They abandoned her. She wandered the streets of Costello. She found a group of individuals who were also homeless, who bonded with her and began to teach her where the fountains were to drink or to wash herself. They taught her how to maneuver the streets, to learn the street grid, where are the best places to beg for alms or food, and what are the best entrance ways to sleep at night. After a while, a monastic community of nuns thought, well, because she attends church so much at the Dominican church, maybe she would be eligible to join us. So they brought her in. She's a novice, except Margaret totally followed the rule. And the other nuns didn't like this because they were in lapse of the rule. So they kicked Margaret out. Goodbye. Don't want you. You're bothering us by your adherence. So here she is, a street person again. She's back to begging. She's back at the Dominican church. And she becomes known by the lay Dominican community, the Sisters of Penance of St. Dominic, who saw her so often there. They then began taking turns, letting her stay at their homes for several days. And like Catherine, Margaret had a ministry to the sick in the streets, in their homes, and their prisons, and as well to her fellow Dominican churchers who were also very mean towards her. I'm going to skip the pandemic so I can do at least 5 minutes on St. Martin de Porres. I'll skip the Dominican part. Again, all this will be provided. This is a 25-page paper, so you'll get the full paper with the citations. Now, Martin was a casada, a mulatto, the son of a white, blue-eyed Spanish hidalgo, Don Juan de Porras, spelled with an A and not an E. The E was an error in the Vatican documents, and Martin is now known with the E and not with the A of his father's name. His mother was Ana Velasquez, who attained manumission and became a freed slave. There's no documentation. So Martin was an Afro-Peruvian. He's known as the St. Francis of the Americas. The speculation is that he joined the Dominicans because of the dog with the torch that he saw in the pictures in the statue of St. Dominic in the convent of St. Dominic when he would go to Mass. He called himself the mulatto dog, and when anyone would call him such, and when you read the little stories, which are the recordings of the testimonies given on behalf of Martin for his beatification and his canonization, many of the Dominicans would call him in their anger the mulatto dog, and Martin would quickly reply, "That's right." Mulatto means mula or mule, and in the little stories we also see that dogs, which were a place of honor for Martin. There are also cat stories, mice stories, rat stories, chicken stories, mule stories. He wanted a turkey, a grown bull, 2 calves, and he allowed the novices to play with 2 young bulls, which kind of brought havoc to the convent. He was a sanador, a healer. He was a donato, a lay Dominican servant. He was not a converso or a legos. He was not a lay professed Dominican. But after 3 years as a donato, he, the whole convent voted to allow him to say the life vows as if he were a converso, a legos, a lay professed Dominican brother. He studied under an apothecary as part of his training. He was apprenticed under 2 healers, the first being a herbalist who taught him the art of preparing herbs, and the second was a barber surgeon. And he also learned some dentistry, but it's told that there was another infirmarian, another donato who was a barber surgeon. His healing method is compared commonly to accepted 17th century surgical techniques with religion and medicinal beliefs of the African, Indian, and peninsular origins. To this end, he applied many peculiar remedies and blessed his patients several times with the cross during his treatment. Now, he avoided directly ever touching a patient. And in the little stories you will hear where he is being told to place their hand, he refrained from doing that because he didn't want to be seen as a miracle worker. But as he's putting on the ointments or putting the herbal powders on or bandaging, he's touching. So he's transferring the power of God while providing what was considered normal medicine at the time. So there is the healing. He treated not only the friars, but also the lay servants and the slaves in the convent of St. Dominic. And he would go into the street and treat the most destitute. But he was known, especially because he was also being called by the most powerful within the city of Lima in order to treat them as well. They were going to the physicians. Now, physicians at this time had degrees in medicine, but also in theology. They were there to consult. They were not there to treat. The surgeons at this time would do the tending of the wounds and the removal of boils and pus and so forth. So they were looked down upon. They were not esteemed like the physicians were because they were lower dealing with the humors which were not pure. And then you had the herbalists and the apothecary and so forth, as I've already previously mentioned. But the Criollos of Lima were the largest number to come to testify for the canonical process of St. Martin. And so while the friars were dead to the world, they were not immune to sickness and disease that affected society at large. There was an epidemic in Lima that came from Cartagena. It was possibly typhus. And it really hit the Black population in Lima. And Lima at this time was over 50% Afro-Peruvian or Afro-Sub-Saharan African. Martin was, the novice master would allow Martin to spend as much time as Martin could with the novices because of his example. So while Martin could not preach from a pulpit or teach in the classroom, his heart overflowed with love, and therefore his tongue was never silent because of the acts. When we were looking at the vow of obedience the other day, I was reminded of a story where the prior of the convent came to Martin and said, you can no longer bring in people who are not religious of our order. You can't bring in people from off the street and treat them in your room. Martin was seldom in his bed. He always had someone else who needed treatment, who had no home of their own. So bringing in the Indians from the streets, bringing in the poor slaves in order to give them treatment. And one day someone found out from the convent, another of the brothers found that Martin had someone in his room, contrary to the order of the prior. And this person, as a good friar, went and told on Martin. Now, when the prior came to Martin and started holding him accountable, Martin lowered his eyes, as he always did while being corrected, and said, but Father Prior, does not charity of Christ outweigh obedience to one's prior? And the prior smiled and walked away. So the ideal of Dominican spirituality is attained in the mixed life of action, springing from contemplation. It's not strange that when we look at the whole life of Martin, that we find that the stages of the soul's ascent to sanctity, as noted by St. Catherine, are there in Martin's life. His contemporaries called him the father of the poor, the father of charity, the father of all, and he was truly paternal in his beneficence. Let me end, again, Rose will be in the folder, which I will record and send an attachment to. Let me end with the words of St. Catherine of Siena. All that we do, whether in word or in work, for the salvation of our neighbor is true prayer, although we must consecrate some time to pray in the strict sense. I thank you, and I have one request. If anyone finds a volume 2 of Hinnenbusch's History of the Dominicans, I cannot find it, and I will gladly pay whatever you find the cost when with postage. I am in great need for that for some of the writings that I am doing. So thank you very much.
Brother Mick, I can't express my gratitude for the history, for the depth of the study, and for your efforts. We've got about 10 minutes for question, and then we're going to take about a 10-minute break before we're led in a prayer session. So, questions for Brother Mick?
I don't have a question. I don't have a question, brother, but I just wanted to say it was outstanding presentation, and your level of detail in history was just exceptional. Very, very enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I too want to say thank you. And you say you are going to record this and it will be available to us?
Right, you'll get a second YouTube from me, which will be the full thing with the PowerPoint, and I will go over all the individuals I could not get into in further depth.
Okay. Are you in the process of publishing a work on this topic?
It will be a chapter in my book, the Dominic Option, the Public and Intellectual Monasticism.
Great. Oh, I hope we all get word of it when it's ready.
I have 3 readers at Aquinas Institute of Theology here in St. Louis who are going through the manuscript. So once I get past them, it will be sent out to you.
Okay, great.
I'm impressed.
But you will get a PDF of this actual talk as well, the 25-page article that will be in one of the Dominican journals.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Other thoughts or questions?
Brother Mick, could you hypothesize perhaps correlations between these times that you've studied and our own, and maybe implications, just real quick, for what we should be doing? Because obviously we cannot go tend plague victims in the same way, which has been an utter frustration for many caregivers and clergy and brothers and sisters, etc. But go ahead.
Well, if we look at the Dominicans from dealing with the AIDS pandemic in the beginning, it was very much like coronavirus is now. How close can I get to this individual without it becoming contagious to me? So some of the same lessons that we can learn from their ministry can also be applied now. But we have the benefit, but also the burning coal in our pocket of technology now. And what is that going to mean for the church and for our individual ministries and parishes? Will people come back? Will we have to continue both methods of ministry for the future? So that's going to have ramifications of how we deal with the home bound and that alienation. Let me also, one thing I forgot to mention about Martin, like St. Catherine, he also, he didn't carry a lamp, but he carried a brazier with lit coals in it. And he would always throw a sprig of rosemary in it when he was treating a patient. And it became known that if Martin was not at your bedside, you were going to live, because he was only at the bedside of those who are going to die. So if I dream of Martin, I'm thinking that it may be a sign from God at my bedside.
Okay, why don't we take about 15 minutes?